Have you ever sat alone in your kitchen, holding your phone, wondering why it hasn't rung? Maybe it's your son's birthday message that never came, or a visit that was promised but quietly forgotten. You remember the days when his little hand reached for yours, when your presence was the center of his world. And now, silence. Not a cruel silence, just that kind that seeps in quietly, day by day, until one afternoon you find yourself asking, "When did I stop being important?" You're not alone in that feeling. So many mothers, strong, devoted, loving, feel that ache. It's not just about missed calls or forgotten holidays. It's something deeper, something harder to explain. Because the truth is, he might not even realize how much it hurts. And you might not understand why he's pulling away when all you ever did was love him. Today, we're going to explore that together by looking closely at the hidden forces that shape our closest relationships. Now I know, sometimes these conversations can sound like something out of an old psychology book. But don't worry. What we're talking about here isn't about science. It's about life. Your life. Your love. Your story as a mother. And how sometimes the very love we pour into our children can, without meaning to, become the reason they feel they need to distance themselves. Let's begin with a simple truth. Much of what shapes human behavior happens beneath the surface, in places we don't always see or understand. That means your son might not even realize why he feels a heaviness when he hears your voice, why he doesn't call back, why he keeps his answers short. He might love you more than he knows how to say, but feel overwhelmed by emotions he can't name. Imagine this. A little boy grows up in a house where he feels deeply loved, maybe even adored. But over time, that love becomes more than just comfort. It becomes responsibility. It becomes pressure. Maybe you gave everything to him. You sacrificed your own needs. You made him the center of your world. That's what mothers do, right? But sometimes, without realizing it, that kind of love, limitless, boundaryless, can feel to a child like a chain. Not because it was a chain, but because he didn't yet know how to carry the weight of it. When a mother gives too much without leaving space for her own identity, the child can grow up feeling emotionally suffocated. He doesn't see you as a person anymore. He sees you as a part of himself that he's trying to break away from. And here's where it gets tricky. The more you try to stay close, the more he might feel the need to pull away. Not because he doesn't love you, but because, in his heart, your presence reminds him of who he once was. Small, dependent, vulnerable. And for someone trying to prove to himself that he's grown up, that memory is hard to face. You might have noticed this when you offer advice and he snaps back, or when you ask about his life and he gives cold, clipped answers. That's not rejection. That's emotional repression, when someone pushes away what they can't process. He's not angry at you. He's fighting something inside himself. Now let's go even deeper. Let's talk about the Oedipus complex. And no, it's not about strange feelings or taboos like people often misunderstand. It's really about something we all go through. The need to grow up, to separate from our parents, to become our own person. For a son, this often means pulling away from his mother. Not because he wants to hurt her, but because he doesn't know how to stand tall while still being close. It's like learning to swim. At some point, the child needs to let go of the edge of the pool. But what happens when the edge keeps reaching out, calling him back? He might panic. He might flail. And he might swim away, not out of cruelty, but out of fear that if he turns back, he'll lose the strength he's just learning to find. As mothers, we often see distance and think it means failure. We ask ourselves, did I do something wrong? Was I too soft? Too strict? Too present? Not present enough? The questions circle, and the silence becomes louder. But what if, just what if, this isn't about failure at all? What if his pulling away is simply a clumsy way of trying to grow? I believe that unresolved emotions in the child, fears, guilt, even sadness, often get projected onto the mother. That means your son might be carrying pain that has nothing to do with you, but he sees you as the one who caused it. Maybe it's disappointment from school, stress from marriage, anger at his father, or even struggles with himself, and somehow, without realizing it, all of that gets placed on you. You become, in his mind, the symbol of every demand, every expectation, every pressure. And it hurts. It really, really hurts. Because all you ever wanted was to help. But to him, that helping hand can feel like a reminder of everything he still hasn't figured out. It's called unconscious transference. When we respond not to the person in front of us, but to everything they represent inside our own emotional world. So what can we do? Well, it begins with understanding that love doesn't always look the way we expect. Sometimes, love sounds like silence. Sometimes, love walks away so it can come back stronger. And sometimes, love needs room to breathe. That doesn't mean you have to stop caring. It means you shift from trying to protect to learning how to guide. From being the anchor to becoming the lighthouse. You don't pull him back in, you stand steady and let your light show him the way home when he's ready. It takes courage to let go of what used to be, to release the idea that you're responsible for his happiness, even now. Healing only begins when we stop reacting and start understanding, when we stop waiting for gratitude and start reclaiming our own wholeness. Maybe today, it's time to pause. Not to give up, never that, but to gently open the door to a new kind of love. One that gives space. One that doesn't press or ask or demand. One that simply is. And as we keep exploring this together, you'll begin to see, sometimes the most powerful thing a mother can do is not to hold tighter, but to stand still, with grace and with peace in her heart. Let's take a quiet breath together and keep going. You see, what's repressed doesn't disappear, it returns. Not in the way we expect, but through behaviors, habits, and distance that don't seem to make sense at first. That might explain why your son seems irritated when you offer kindness, or why your simple questions are met with silence or sarcasm. It's not you he's angry at. It's the emotional clutter inside him that he hasn't sorted through yet. And here's something important. That clutter didn't always come from you. In many cases, a son who feels disconnected from his mother is also struggling with unresolved feelings toward his father or authority figures from his past. Maybe his father was emotionally distant, overly critical, or simply not present. Those memories don't just vanish. They sit deep in the unconscious, and often unfairly, the mother becomes the emotional target, the lightning rod for all the unspoken disappointments and fears. You might be thinking, but I was always there. I gave everything. Why am I the one being pushed away? And that's a fair, honest question. In relationships where love was given in abundance, especially when it was constant and without clear boundaries, the child can grow up feeling emotionally saturated, almost as if he never had the space to find his own emotional voice. It's heartbreaking, but the more you gave, the more he might now feel the need to break away, not because he doesn't care, but because he never learned how to be close without feeling smothered. To him, every loving gesture may feel like a quiet tug, pulling him back into a version of himself he's trying to outgrow. This doesn't mean you should stop loving. Not at all. But it does mean that your love may need to evolve. From doing into being. From fixing into listening. From helping into allowing. When a son distances himself emotionally, it's often because he doesn't know how to exist in your presence as the man he's become. He still feels like that small boy, the one who needed you for everything, and now he's trying desperately to prove to you, to the world, and to himself that he can stand on his own. This process, if unresolved, can create a painful cycle. The son craves the emotional safety of his mother, yet fears being swallowed up by it. And so, the cycle begins. You reach out, he pulls away. You send messages, he leaves them unread. You show up with love, he responds with indifference. But deep down, both of you are aching. Both of you want connection. You just don't know how to find it without reopening wounds. This is where something called separation anxiety enters, and not just for the child, but for the mother too. If your identity for many years was built around being his everything, his support, his comfort, his guide, then his distance now feels like you've been erased. And that feeling, it's one of the loneliest in the world. But let me say this clearly, you are not invisible. Your value isn't measured by how many times he calls or how often he visits. Your worth isn't dependent on how needed you are. And the love you've given, all those meals, hugs, stories, sleepless nights, they don't disappear. They live on in him, whether he knows it or not. Healing starts when pain becomes conscious. When instead of reacting with anger, with guilt, with pressure, we begin to understand. We see not just the behavior, but the hidden need behind it. Your son might not say it out loud, but somewhere inside, he carries a guilt for hurting you, for avoiding you, for not knowing how to be the son you once knew. But guilt is a tricky thing. It doesn't bring people closer. It makes them hide. It makes them push away the one who reminds them of what they haven't faced. That's why sometimes the more loving you are, the more distant he becomes, not because of rejection, but because of a deep emotional conflict he hasn't yet named. And if you're still listening, still here with me, I want you to hear this loud and clear. You haven't failed. You haven't loved too much. You've loved in the only way you knew how, fully, fiercely, completely. And now perhaps the path forward is not about giving more, but about giving differently. This might mean letting him sit in silence without trying to fix it, letting him find his way without always being the compass, holding space for him to return, not out of guilt, but out of choice. Real love frees the other person. It doesn't bind. It doesn't demand. It says, I'm here and I love you, even from afar. You might be waiting for a call that never comes, a visit that keeps getting delayed, a thank you that's long overdue. And I know how hard that is. But please remember, your son's struggle with love isn't a reflection of your failure. It's a sign of his own growing pains. The question isn't, why doesn't he love me? It's, what part of himself is he still learning how to love? Because when he learns that, when he finds the courage to face his own fears, his own guilt, his own identity, that's when he'll look back and truly see you. He won't see the woman who called too much or worried too often. He'll see the one who stood steady through it all. The one who loved him, even when he didn't know how to receive it. The one who didn't stop being his mother. She just became his lighthouse. And that quiet, shining strength might be the very thing that helps him find his way home. Let's stay right here for a moment, heart to heart, because where we are now is tender ground. We're not talking about theories anymore. We're talking about what it means to love someone who's drifting away, and to hold that love without letting it harden into bitterness or collapse into sorrow. What we repress often ends up ruling us. And that's especially true in the bond between mother and son. You see, both of you may be holding in more than you realize. You may carry questions you've never spoken aloud. Does he think I failed him? Is he ashamed of me? Did I hold him too tightly? Or not tightly enough? He may carry guilt he's never found the words for. Why can't I talk to her like I used to? Why do I feel angry when I think of her, even when I miss her? But none of those questions make either of you bad people. They make you human. They make this relationship real, messy, beautiful, hard. There's something many of us only learn later in life. That deep emotional bonds, when not nurtured with awareness, can become prisons. Not because we stop loving, but because we don't know how to grow inside that love. And when the son doesn't feel space to be his full self, he may unconsciously express something known as inverted love. That's when someone who still feels deeply connected shows it through rejection. In other words, every sharp word, every ignored call, may be hiding a silent plea. Help me separate. Help me find myself. But please, don't stop loving me while I do. And here's the cruel twist. Often, a mother hears that rejection and believes the opposite. He must not care anymore. He must not remember. But the truth is, he may remember everything. Your touch, your warmth, the way you stood up for him. He just doesn't know how to hold those memories while trying to step into the man he's still becoming. You may find yourself caught between longing and letting go, wanting to tell him what to do, what you see so clearly, because you've lived longer, loved deeper, and seen how life unfolds. But when advice feels like control, or care feels like criticism, the son pulls further away. Not because you're wrong, but because he's still trying to prove he can survive without the shelter you once were. It's a delicate dance. One step too close, and he recoils. One step too far, and he disappears. This is the battlefield of autonomy, that inner tug-of-war between the desire to be close and the fear of losing oneself. The son wants to be his own man, and sometimes the only way he knows how is by rejecting the one who once defined his world. But here's the miracle. When a mother stops chasing and starts trusting, when she stands still in quiet strength, something shifts. Because eventually, most sons circle back. Maybe not with flowers or long speeches, maybe just with a message that says, "Thinking of you," or a visit where the silence isn't awkward anymore, or a moment when he says, not in words, but in presence, "I still need you, just differently now." And what allows that to happen isn't guilt, it's space. What opens the door again is not asking more, but expecting less. Not because you're giving up, but because you're loving with open hands instead of grasping ones. Now, I want to speak gently to the part of you that might be grieving. Because yes, there is grief in motherhood. Not just when a child leaves the nest, but when the closeness you once had fades into polite distance. You might grieve the little boy who told you everything, who ran into your arms without hesitation. You might wonder where he went, and if he'll ever come back. But let me tell you something. The love you planted hasn't died. It's growing roots in him, even if they haven't broken through the surface yet. That kind of love, patient, deep, unselfish, leaves marks on the soul. And one day, he'll feel it again. Perhaps not as a son who needs you to fix his problems, but as a man who finally sees you for who you really are. Not just his mother, but a woman who held space for him when he was most lost. That's why your story isn't over. Healing happens when we allow repressed emotions to be seen. And sometimes the first step isn't a conversation with your son, it's one with yourself. Maybe today is the day you stop measuring your worth by how often he reaches out. Maybe you start measuring it by how bravely you've stood through the silence, by how much love you've carried, even when it went unspoken. That is no small thing. That is grace in motion. So what now? What can you do when your hands feel empty and your heart feels too full? You keep loving, but you also keep living. You find joy in your own voice again. You rediscover the things that make you feel whole, not just as a mother, but as a person. Read that book. Take that walk. Call that friend. Paint. Pray. Laugh. Cry. Let your life stretch beyond the borders of your son's shadow. Because here's the beautiful truth. Even if it's not always said aloud, a mother's greatest gift is not her sacrifice. It's her ability to stay whole even when her child forgets to look back. When your son sees that, when he sees that you've become a lighthouse, not a lifeboat, something inside him will shift. Not because you asked, not because you demanded, but because finally he'll see what he couldn't see before. That love doesn't disappear when it gives space. It grows. quietly, steadily, faithfully, and when he is ready, he'll return. Not out of guilt, but out of gratitude. And if he does return, even just for a quiet moment, it won't be to the same place he left. Because you've changed too. You've softened where you needed to, and strengthened where it mattered most. Not by chasing, not by pleading, but by choosing to live with more awareness and love with more wisdom. This is what it means to transform suffering. Not to erase it, not to forget it, but to reshape it into something more conscious, more grounded. When a mother and son begin to see each other not as expectations, not as roles, but as two imperfect evolving souls, that's when something beautiful starts to unfold. Not the return to what was, but the creation of something new. A bond built not on need, but on understanding. Not on guilt, but on choice. He may never say the words you've waited to hear. He might never admit how much he missed you, or how deeply your absence was felt. But his presence, even in small ways, will begin to speak. A visit without tension, a message without reason, a conversation where he listens, where you both, maybe for the first time in a long time, feel seen. And if that doesn't come soon or at all, that's not the end of your story. You are more than a role. You are not just someone's mother. You are a woman who has lived, who has loved, and who has survived things that words can't always capture. Your value is not up for negotiation. It isn't measured in returned phone calls or remembered birthdays. It lives in your courage to keep loving with an open heart, even after the heartache. The unconscious mind is a powerful force. But there is also the possibility of growth, of becoming more aware, more intentional, more free. And that's what you've done here, just by listening. Just by considering that maybe this distance wasn't personal. Maybe, just maybe, it was the only way he knew how to become who he's trying to be. That doesn't make it easy. It doesn't undo the sting of silence or the ache of being misunderstood. But it does give you something precious, perspective. And from that place of clarity, you can begin to choose peace over pain, self-worth over self-blame, and hope over resentment. You may still grieve what was lost. That's okay. Grief is love with nowhere to go. But in time, that grief can soften into grace, into a quiet kind of strength that says, I loved, I gave, and I grew. That is no small thing. If your son is watching this too, or if one day he does, I hope he sees you not as the mother who demanded too much, or the figure he had to escape, but as the human being who kept loving him even in absence, who allowed space without slamming the door, who didn't need to be perfect to be present. And if you're the son, watching quietly, maybe with a knot in your chest, I want to tell you something too. It's okay not to have it all figured out. It's okay to need space and not know why. But your mother, however imperfect, has likely carried your memory every single day. And all she wants now is a chance to love you without losing you. You don't need to be anyone else. You don't need to fix everything. Just let yourself be human and let her be human too. Because here's the thing about love. It's not the absence of conflict that defines it. It's the ability to stay, to grow, to understand, even when it hurts. So take a deep breath. You've made it to the end of this conversation. But maybe it's the beginning of a new chapter in your own story. Maybe it's a quiet letter you never send, but finally write. A walk where you carry less blame and more peace. A decision to love, not out of obligation, but out of freedom. If this message moved something in you, let it. Let it move you to reach out or to rest. To speak or simply to forgive. And if nothing else, let it remind you that you are not alone. If you're a mother, know that you are still seen, still valuable, still deeply worthy of love. If you're a son, know that your silence isn't the end. It's just a place you're passing through. And if you're both still trying to find each other through the years, the silence, and the scars, Keep your hearts open, because the bond that truly matures is not the one that demands perfection, but the one that learns how to forgive, how to listen, and how to begin again. Before we go, I want to invite you to do something gentle. Leave a comment if this spoke to you. Just a word, a line, a memory. Not for attention, but for release. Let yourself be heard. Share this with someone who may be carrying a quiet sadness too. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Because here, we don't just talk psychology. We talk healing. We talk heart. Thank you for being here. For staying with yourself through this conversation. For having the courage to feel. You deserve peace. You deserve connection. You deserve to be loved even, and especially, when it's quiet. Until next time, take care of your heart. And remember, the love that survives distance is the love that was always strong enough to wait.